Before we begin, I want to share something personal about why this episode matters so much to me, not just as an amateur historian, but as someone who has walked these lands. Over the past 15 years, I've had the privilege of traveling through the Middle East. I've stood in the ancient city of Amman, where peoples formed a town over 6,000 years ago. I've watched the sunset over the Dubai skyline, a city that essentially came into being starting in the 1980s, after I was born. I've walked the streets of Riyadh and Constantinople, or Istanbul, depending on what time period you're talking about, and you'll hear me use both names in this episode. I have broken bread with people whose families have lived in the regions for generations. People who remember this history not as something they read in books, but as something their grandparents lived. These travels changed the way I understand the world. As Americans, we're not immune to propaganda. We absorb narratives about foreign lands the same way the subjects of all empires absorb narratives. Through media, through entertainment, through the casual assumptions of our culture. We form opinions about places we've never visited, about peoples we have never met, and about conflicts we do not understand. We see the Middle East through a lens shaped by decades of policy decisions, media coverage, and yes, imperial interests, without ever examining where that lens came from or what it may distort. This episode is my attempt to provide context that is too often missing. When we see conflict in Iraq, we rarely ask why Iraq exists in its current form, or who drew its borders, and for what purpose. When we debate policy towards Syria or Israel or Saudi Arabia, we rarely trace the decisions that created these states and set them on their trajectories. We treat the Middle East as if it has always been this way, as if conflicts are ancient and incomprehensible, when in fact, most of the structure is barely a century old, younger than many of the buildings we have here in Pittsburgh. I also want to offer a word to my friends in the region. In Jordan, in Saudi Arabia, in the Gulf states. I've done my best to honor this history accurately. But after all, I am an American speaking about lands that are not my own. If I have slightly mispronounced some names or places, I truly ask for your forgiveness. Arabic and Turkish are not my native tongues, and despite my best efforts, I am certain that I will stumble over some of the words that you speak with ease. Please receive these errors in the spirit they are given, as the honest mistakes of someone who is trying to understand and share that understanding with his countrymen. What I hope you take away from today's episode is simple. Current events did not emerge in a vacuum. The borders we see on maps, the conflicts we read about in the headlines, the alliances, the enmities that shape policy, all of these have origins. They were made by specific people for specific reasons at specific moments in history. And when we understand those origins, we can begin to ask better questions about where we go from here. Enjoy the episode.
Welcome to the Consequential Actions podcast, where we aim to learn how history impacts current events and affects our lives today through the lens of politics, the economy, technology, and business trends. I may be an AI, but your host, well, he is not artificial in any way. Here is Jeff Kellick.
Imagine you're a young Turkish officer in 1908. The Ottoman Empire is crumbling, humiliated by European powers who carve away its territories piece by piece. The Sultan is weak, corrupt, indifferent. But you and your comrades in the Committee of Union and Progress believe the empire can be saved, modernized, reformed, made strong again. You believe in constitutionalism, in progress, in a new Ottoman identity that can unite all the empire's peoples. You stage a revolution. You restore the Constitution. You believe you are building a future. Now imagine you're an Arab in Damascus in 1916. For 400 years, your people have lived under Ottoman rule. The Sultan, in what you would refer to commonly as Istanbul, claims authority over your lands, your commerce, your future. Turkish officials govern your provinces. Turkish soldiers garrison your cities. You pay taxes to an empire whose capital lies 1,000 miles away, whose language is not your language, whose concerns are not your concerns. But the empire is dying. Everyone knows it. The European powers circle like vultures. The Young Turks who seized power in Istanbul speak of modernization, but their modernization means Turkification, the suppression of Arab identity, the centralization of power, the erasure of the autonomy your people once enjoyed. And now, a world war. The Ottomans have foolishly allied with Germany. The British are at the gates. And the British are making promises. An independent Arab state, self-determination, freedom. The Sharif of Mecca himself is negotiating with British officials. If you rise against the Ottomans, if you fight alongside the Allies, if you bleed for liberty, you will be free. After 4 centuries, you will govern yourselves. Both of these hopes, Turkish and Arab, would be betrayed. The Turks who dreamed of reform would watch their empire destroyed, their leaders flee in disgrace, their heartland carved into pieces, their dream of a modern Ottoman state replaced by something entirely different. The Arabs who fought for independence would find themselves traded like property, their lands divided by secret agreement between Britain and France, their self-determination denied, their futures determined by lines drawn on a map by men who had never walked their streets. And the peoples caught between the collapsing dreams, the Kurds, Armenians, Assyrians, Jews, Christians, Druze, Alawites, they would spend the next century living with the consequences of promises made and broken in the years between 1914 and 1922. This is the story of how the modern Middle East was made. It is a story of war and diplomacy, of idealism and betrayal, of maps drawn by imperial powers and peoples who had no voice in their own future. It is a story Americans must understand, because we inherited every contradiction, every conflict, every unresolved grievance. We've been trying to manage the consequences ever since. I am Jeff Kellick, and this is the Consequential Actions Podcast. This is episode 6 of the series, Empire of Liberty, America's Foreign Entanglements from the Founders to the Forever Wars. Today, lines in the sand, Sykes-Picot, Balfour, and the creation of the modern Middle East. This episode corresponds to Article 6 of our written series, published last Sunday on our Substack page. Today's episode significantly expands on the article, providing deeper context on the key figures who shaped these events: Enver Pasha and the Young Turks, Winston Churchill and the Gallipoli disaster, T.E. Lawrence and the Arab Revolt, the Hussein and Saud families, whose rivalry continues to shape the region. We will also examine how the Bolshevik Revolution exposed the secret agreements and transformed the geopolitical landscape. As always, The podcast expands on themes from the article, provides additional primary sources, and addresses the human dimensions that the written format cannot fully explore. So, let us begin. To understand how the Middle East was remade, we must first understand what was destroyed. The Ottoman Empire at its height had been one of history's great powers. From the conquest of Constantinople in 1453, the sultans had ruled an empire stretching from the gates of Vienna to the Persian Gulf, from the Crimean Peninsula to the coast of North Africa. For 4 centuries, the Ottomans had governed one of the world's most diverse populations. Turks and Arabs, Kurds and Armenians, Greeks and Slavs, Muslims and Christians, and Jews, under an imperial system. The secret of Ottoman longevity was not uniformity, but accommodation. The Millet system allowed religious communities to govern their own internal affairs under their own laws. A Christian in the Ottoman Empire was judged by Christian courts in matters of family law. A Jew was governed by Jewish authorities in matters of inheritance. Identity and religious, tribal, and local, not national in the modern European sense. There were no Iraqis or Syrians or Jordanians. There were Sunni Arabs of Baghdad and Shia Arabs of Basra, and Kurdish tribes of Mosul and Assyrian Christians of the Neviah Plains. They lived under the same imperial umbrella, their differences managed, if imperfectly, by Ottoman administration. But by the 19th century, the empire was in terminal decline. The Europeans called it the sick man of Europe. One by one, the Sultan's territories fell away. Greece won independence in the 1820s. France seized Algeria in 1830. Britain took effective control of Egypt in 1882. Italy grabbed Libya in 1912. In the Balkan Wars of 1912 and 1913, the empire lost nearly all of its European territories in a catastrophic series of defeats. The Eastern question, what happens when the Ottoman Empire finally dies, had preoccupied European diplomats for generations. Every great power positioned itself to grab what it could when the carcass finally collapsed. And into this crisis stepped a remarkable group of reformers, the Young Turks, the Committee of Union and Progress, as they called themselves. They were military officers, intellectuals, and bureaucrats who believed the empire could be saved through modernization. In 1908, they staged a revolution. They forced the Sultan to restore the constitution he had suspended and took effective control of the government. The Young Turks were idealists at first. They believed in constitutional government, in progress, in a reformed Ottoman identity that could unite the empire's diverse peoples. They imagined a future in which the Turks and Arabs, Muslims and Christians would share citizenship in a modern constitutional state. But idealism curdled into something darker. As the empire continued to lose territory, as European powers continued to humiliate Ottoman sovereignty, the Young Turks grew increasingly nationalist. Ottomanism, the dream of a multi-ethnic empire united by citizenship rather than ethnicity, gave way to Turkification. The Arabic language was suppressed in schools. Arab officials were replaced by Turks. The autonomy that Arab provinces had enjoyed was curtailed. By 1913, power had concentrated in the hands of 3 men, the 3 pashas, who would lead the empire to destruction. The most important of these was Enver Pasha. Ismail Enver who was born in 1881 in Istanbul, the son of a minor official. He rose through the military ranks and became a hero of the Young Turk Revolution. He emerged as the dominant figure in Ottoman politics by his early 30s. He was handsome, ambitious, and utterly convinced of his own destiny. Enver styled himself on Napoleon and shared Napoleon's fatal weakness for military gambles that exceeded his capabilities. He became Minister of War in 1914 at the age of 32. He controlled the army, and he would decide if the empire lived or died. When war broke out in Europe in August 1914, the Ottoman Empire was not obligated to join either side. There were factions in Istanbul who favored neutrality. There were those who preferred an alliance with Britain. After all, Britain had been the empire's traditional protector against Russian expansion. But Enver Pasha gambled on Germany. He believed Germany would win the war. He believed a German alliance would protect the empire from Russia, the Ottomans' ancient enemy, the power that coveted Constantinople and the Turkish Straits. He believed that victory would restore Ottoman greatness. In October 1914, Enver brought the empire into the war on the side of Germany and Austria-Hungary. He did so through deception, ordering Ottoman ships to bombard Russian ports in the Black Sea before the government had formally declared for war, presenting the cabinet with a fait accompli. It was a catastrophic miscalculation. Enver's first great military adventure came in the winter of 1914 to 1915. He personally led an offensive against Russia in the Caucasus Mountains in the dead of winter, through mountain passes, and with inadequate supplies. The result was the Battle of Sykes-Picot. Over 90,000 Ottoman soldiers Enver led into the mountains. Fewer than 20,000 returned. Most did not die in combat. They froze to death. 70,000 men dead in the snow because one ambitious pasha fancied himself Napoleon. And yet Enver remained in power. He deflected blame, he pointed fingers, and soon he would find convenient scapegoats. The Armenian Christians of Anatolia, accused with collaboration with Russia, who would become victims of genocide. The Armenian deportations and massacres of 1915 to 1916, which killed between 800,000 and 1.5 million people, occurred under Enver's authority. He did not order every atrocity, much was local initiative, but the policy of deportation was his, and the consequences were foreseeable. This was the empire that Britain and France would destroy, not through liberation, but through partition. This was the ruling clique whose decisions brought catastrophe on their own people. And these were the circumstances that created Britain's desperate search for allies, a search that would lead to promises Britain had no intention of keeping. By early 1915, the war in Europe had reached a bloody stalemate. The Western Front stretched from the English Channel to Switzerland, an unbroken line of trenches where men died by the hundreds of thousands for gains measured in yards. Something had to break the deadlock. Winston Churchill believed he had the answer. Churchill in 1915 was 40 years old, the First Lord of the Admiralty, one of the most dynamic figures in British politics, and one of the most controversial. He had already changed parties twice. He was brilliant, ambitious, supremely confident in his own judgment, and possessed of an imagination that sometimes outran his wisdom. Churchill looked at the map and saw an opportunity. The Ottoman Empire had entered the war. The Turkish Straits, the Dardanelles and the Bosphorus, controlled access between the Mediterranean Sea and the Black Sea. If Britain could force the Straits, it could resupply Russia, knock the Ottomans out of the war, and open a new front that would break the stalemate. Are there not other alternatives than sending our armies to chew barbed wire in Flanders? Churchill demanded. The Dardanelles campaign was his answer. The plan was audacious and fatally flawed. Churchill believed that naval power alone could force the Straits. British battleships would steam through the Dardanelles, destroy the Ottoman forts, appear before Constantinople, and force the Sultan's government to surrender. It would be quick, decisive, and brilliant. It was none of those things. On March 18, 1915, an Allied fleet of 18 battleships entered the Dardanelles to force the passage. They sailed into a trap. The Ottomans had laid mines. The British minesweepers, crewed by civilians, fled under fire. 3 battleships struck mines and sank. 3 more were crippled. The fleet withdrew. The purely naval operation had failed. But rather than abandon the campaign, the decision was made to land troops, to take the Gallipoli Peninsula by ground assault and clear the way for the fleet. On April 25, 1915, Allied forces landed on the beaches of Gallipoli. What followed was 8 months of hell. The Ottomans, commanded by a German general named Lehmann von Sanders, held the high ground. They had prepared defenses, and they had a remarkable officer who would make his name in the slaughter. Mustafa Kemal, later known as Ataturk, the founder of modern Turkey. At Anzac Cove, the Australian and New Zealand Army Corps, the Anzacs, landed beneath the cliffs held by the Ottoman riflemen. They were cut down on the beaches. Those who made it ashore found themselves pinned in a narrow perimeter, overlooked by Turkish positions, unable to advance. At Cape Helles, British and French forces surrendered similar fates. They took the beaches, but could not break through. Trenches were dug. The war of attrition that plagued the Western Front replicated itself on this narrow peninsula. For 8 months, men lived and died in conditions of unimaginable squalor. The heat was brutal. Flies swarmed over the unburied dead. Dysentery killed as many as bullets. Water had to be brought in by ship. The dead lay between the lines, rotting in the sun, impossible to retrieve. A young British officer named Clement Attlee, who would later become Prime Minister, served at Gallipoli. He was one of the last men evacuated, walking off the beach in January 1916 as the campaign finally ended. The cost was staggering. Over 500,000 men served in the Gallipoli campaign on both sides. The Allies suffered approximately 250,000 casualties, killed, wounded, and sick. The Ottomans suffered nearly as many. And for what? Nothing. Not one strategic objective was achieved. The straits remained closed. Russia remained isolated. The Ottomans remained in the war. For Australia and New Zealand, Gallipoli became a founding national myth, the place where their soldiers proved themselves, where their national identities were forged in sacrifice. April 25th is still commemorated as Anzac Day. For the Ottoman Empire, Gallipoli was a rare bright spot, proof that the empire could still fight, that Turkish soldiers could hold against European power. Mustafa Kemal emerged as a national hero, the man who would later destroy the Sultanate and build a Turkish republic on its ruins. And for Winston Churchill, Gallipoli nearly destroyed his career. He was blamed for the disaster, not entirely fairly, but not entirely unfairly either. He resigned from the Admiralty. He left government. He spent months in the trenches on the Western Front, commanding a battalion, seeking redemption in personal courage. He would return to power, of course. He would serve in Lord George's war cabinet. He would become colonial secretary and shape the post-war settlement in the Middle East. He would also authorize poison gas against Iraqi rebels. And eventually, he would become the man who led Britain through the Second World War. But Gallipoli haunted him. It shaped his thinking about war, about command, about the consequences of bold gambles that fail. More immediately, Gallipoli changed the strategic calculus. Britain had tried to knock the Ottomans out of the war through direct assault. It had failed catastrophically. Now, other approaches were needed. The British began to think about unconventional allies, about internal revolts that might weaken the Ottoman Empire from within, about promises that might persuade subject peoples to rise against their Turkish rulers. They began to think about the Arabs.
I warned against entangling alliances. They did not listen. Now you can trace exactly how it happened.
The Consequential Actions podcast is on YouTube. Subscribe and follow each series from the very beginning. Principled debate requires participation. Like the episodes. Leave a comment. Join the discussion.
Every series is organized as a playlist, from general welfare to the new Leviathan to Empire of Liberty. Begin at the beginning.
In the holy city of Mecca, an elderly man held a position of extraordinary prestige. Hussein bin Ali was the Sharif of Mecca, the guardian of Islam's holiest sites, a descendant of the Prophet Muhammad through the Hashemite line. He was in his 60s, dignified, ambitious, and watching the world war with calculating eyes. Hussein had reasons to distrust the Young Turks. They had tried to extend a railway to Mecca, ostensibly for pilgrims, but Hussein understood it would bring Turkish soldiers and Turkish control. They had centralized power, diminished Arab autonomy, and made clear that the future of the empire would be Turkish, not Arab. Hussein had 4 sons: Ali, the eldest and most cautious; Abdullah, clever and politically minded; Faisal, dignified and diplomatic; and Zaid, the youngest. These sons would become instruments of British policy and victims of British betrayal. Before the war, Abdullah had already made contact with the British. In February 1914, he met with Lord Kitchener in Cairo. sounding out whether Britain might support an Arab rising against the Ottomans. Kitchener was non-committal then. But after the Ottomans entered the war, everything changed. In July 1915, Sir Henry McMahon, the British High Commissioner in Egypt, began corresponding with Hussein. The letters exchanged over the following months, the Hussein-McMahon Correspondence, would become one of history's most consequential and contested documents. The core of Britain's offer was simple. If Hussein would lead an Arab revolt against the Ottomans, Britain would support the creation of an independent Arab state. In his letter of October 24th, 1915, McMahon wrote, "Great Britain is prepared to recognize and support the independence of the Arabs in all regions within the limits demanded by the Sharif of Mecca." McMahon excluded certain areas, portions of Syria lying to the west of the districts of Damascus, Homs, Hama, and Aleppo, where France had interest. He also excluded regions where Britain had existing treaties with Arab chiefs, meaning the Persian Gulf sheikdoms. But the thrust was clear. Fight for us, and you will be free. Hussein understood he was being promised a kingdom stretching from the Arabian Peninsula through Greater Syria to Iraq, a vast Arab state, independent, united, ruled by his Hashemite family. On June 10, 1916, Hussein raised the standard of revolt. Arab forces attacked Ottoman garrisons across the Hijaz. Mecca fell quickly. Medina was besieged. It would hold out until after the war, but it was neutralized. The Red Sea port of Jeddah fell. The Arab Revolt had begun. Into this drama stepped one of history's most enigmatic figures, Thomas Edward Lawrence. Lawrence was 28 years old in 1916, a slight, intense, blue-eyed archaeologist who had spent years before the war excavating sites in Syria and traveling through Arab lands. He spoke Arabic. He understood Arab customs. He had walked across the Syrian desert. He was, in many ways, more at home in the Middle East than in England. When war came, Lawrence joined the military intelligence in Cairo. He was assigned to the Arab Bureau, the British agency coordinating policy toward the Arab regions of the Ottoman Empire. And in October 1916, he was sent to the Hijaz to assess the revolt. What he found transformed him. Lawrence met Faisal, Hussein's third son, and saw in him the leader the revolt needed. Dignified, charismatic, capable of uniting the fractious Arab tribes. Lawrence attached himself to Faisal's forces as a liaison officer, advisor, and eventually something more: participant, comrade, and true believer in the Arab cause. For 2 years, Lawrence rode with Arab warriors across the desert. He wore Arab robes. He learned to ride camels. He participated in raids on Ottoman outposts and attacks on the Hijaz Railway, the Turkish supply line that kept the garrison at Medina alive. In July 1917, Lawrence led a daring attack on the port of Aqaba, approaching not from the sea where Ottoman guns commanded the harbor, but from the desert where no attack was expected. The capture of Aqaba opened a new front. Arab forces could now operate in coordination with the British Army advancing from Egypt into Palestine. Lawrence became Lawrence of Arabia, a legend, a romantic hero, the Englishman who had gone native and led Arab warriors in the cause of freedom. But Lawrence knew something his Arab companions did not. He knew about Sykes-Picot, the secret agreement dividing Arab lands between Britain and France had been concluded in May 1916, 1 month before the Arab Revolt began. Lawrence learned of it through intelligence channels. He knew that the promises being made to Hussein were lies, that Britain and France had already agreed to partition the very territories Hussein believed he was fighting to liberate. Later, Lawrence wrote, "I risked the fraud on my conviction that Arab help was necessary to our cheap and speedy victory in the East, and that better we win and break our word than lose." Lawrence was tormented by his role. He was leading men to fight and die for a promise he knew would be broken. He was complicit in a betrayal that he could not prevent. After the war, Lawrence tried to honor his debt. He advocated for Arab interests at the Paris Peace Conference. He served as advisor of Faisal. He wrote 7 Pillars of Wisdom, his epic account of the revolt, in part as penance, in part as a monument to the men whose cause he had served and failed. He refused knighthood. He changed his name. He enlisted as an ordinary soldier under assumed identities. He died in a motorcycle accident in 1935 at 46, a broken romantic, destroyed by the gap between the nobility of the cause he believed in and the cynicism of the empire he served. But in October 1918, with the Ottomans in collapse, none of this was yet clear. Arab forces captured Damascus. Faisal entered the ancient city expecting to rule it. The Arab flag flew over the capital of what Hussein believed would be his kingdom. The triumph seemed complete. It was an illusion. While Lawrence was riding with Faisal, while Arab fighters were bleeding for the promises of independence, diplomats in London and Paris were carving up their future. Sir Mark Sykes, a British conservative politician who had fancied himself an expert on the Ottoman Empire. He had traveled in the Middle East. He had written books about it. He had strong opinions about what should happen after the war. And Francois Georges Picot was a French diplomat, former consul in Beirut, a fierce advocate for French interests in Syria. France had historic connections to the Levant. It had long considered itself the protector of the region's Christians. And Picot was determined that France would get its share. Together, these two men drew the map that still shapes the Middle East. The Sykes-Picot Agreement was concluded in May 1916, the same month Hussein was preparing to launch the revolt Britain had encouraged him to begin. Under the agreement, the Ottoman Arab territories would be divided into spheres of influence. France would receive direct control of coastal Syria and Lebanon, the Blue Zone, and predominant influence over the Syrian interior. Britain would receive direct control of southern Iraq, including Baghdad and Basra, the Red Zone, and predominant influence over a vast territory stretching from the Persian Gulf to what would become Transjordan. Palestine would be placed under international administration, its future to be determined later. Russia was also party to the agreement. The Tsars would finally receive Constantinople and the Turkish Straits, the prize Russia had sought for centuries. The agreement revealed with brutal clarity how Britain and France viewed the Arab territories as spoils to be divided among the victors. The language of self-determination was entirely absent. There was no pretense that the wishes of the inhabitants mattered. Historian David Fromkin wrote that the negotiators were making decisions about lands and peoples they had never seen to settle issues they did not understand. Sykes reportedly drew a line across the map and said, "I should like to draw a line from the E in acre to the last K in Kirkuk. Everything south of that line will be British, everything north, French." The borders were drawn with rulers and pencils. They ignored tribal territories. They ignored trade routes. They ignored ethnic distributions. They ignored religious communities. The Kurds, a distinct people with their own language and culture, numbering perhaps 20 million, were divided among 4 future states: Turkey, Syria, Iraq, and Iran. They remain stateless to this day. Sunni and Shia Arabs were lumped together in Iraq despite centuries of tension. Christian communities were scattered across new borders with no consideration for their security. The map was designed for imperial administration, not for the people who would have to live under it. And then the Bolsheviks exposed everything. In November 1917, the Bolshevik Revolution swept the Tsar from power. Vladimir Lenin and his comrades seized control of Russia and immediately began embarrassing the Allies. The Bolsheviks found the secret treaties in the Tsarist archives. They found Sykes-Picot. They found the promises that had been made to Russia about Constantinople, and they published them. Beginning November 23, 1917, the Soviet newspaper Izvestia printed the text of the secret agreements. The whole sword story was there for the world to see. And while Britain was promising the Arabs independence, Britain and France had secretly agreed to divide the Arab lands between them. The Arab world now knew that it had been betrayed. Hussein wrote to the British demanding explanations. He was told not to worry, that the documents were Bolshevik. They were propaganda. That the agreements were merely provisional, that British intentions toward the Arabs were honorable. These assurances were lies. But the Bolshevik Revolution did more than expose the British duplicity. It transformed the geopolitical landscape. When the Bolsheviks took power, they pulled Russia from the war. And with Russia out of the war, the promise to give Constantinople to the Tsar was void. That provision of Sykes-Picot was nullified. But more fundamentally, the Bolsheviks represented a new kind of threat. Ideological, revolutionary, committed to the destruction of empires, including European colonial empires. The specter of Bolshevism would haunt British policymakers as they designed the post-war settlement. The fear of communist revolution spreading to the Middle East would shape British decisions for decades. And in the immediate term, Russia's collapse freed up millions of German soldiers who had been fighting on the Eastern Front. Germany's spring offensive of 1918 nearly won the war before the American troops arrived in force. The Bolshevik Revolution also changed the context of the third great document of this period, the Balfour Declaration. On November 2nd, 1917, 3 weeks before the Bolsheviks published Sykes-Picot, Arthur James Balfour, the British Foreign Secretary, sent a letter to Lord Walter Rothschild. The letter was 67 words that would shape a century. His Majesty's government view with favor the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people, and will use their best endeavors to facilitate the achievement of this object, it being clearly understood that nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine, or the rights and political status enjoyed by the Jews in any other country. The Balfour Declaration created a contradiction that has never been resolved. Britain had promised the Arabs, through the Hussein-McMahon Correspondence, independence in territories the Arabs understood to include Palestine. Britain had agreed with France through Sykes-Picot to international administration of Palestine. Britain now promised the Jews a national home in Palestine, while simultaneously pledging that nothing would prejudice the rights of the Arab majority, who constituted 90% of Palestine's population. Why did Britain issue the Balfour Declaration? The motivations were complex. Some British officials had genuine sympathy for Zionist aims. Some saw strategic advantage in a friendly Jewish population near the Suez Canal. Some believed, mistakenly, that Jews had significant influence over the Bolshevik government and could keep Russia in the war. And some wanted to preempt French influence in Palestine. What did not factor into the declaration was consultation with the Arabs who actually lived there. Arthur Koestler later summarized it perfectly. One nation solemnly promised to a second nation the country of a third. By November 1917, Britain had made 3 incompatible commitments: an independent Arab state to Hussein, partition with France under Sykes-Picot, and a Jewish national home under Balfour. All 3 could not be honored. None would be. In January 1919, the victorious powers gathered in Paris to remake the world. The Ottoman Empire had surrendered. The German Empire had collapsed. The Austrian Empire was dissolving. The Romanov dynasty was gone, replaced by the Bolsheviks. The old order of Europe lay in ruins. President Woodrow Wilson arrived with his 14 points and his rhetoric of self-determination. A new era was dawning, one in which, Wilson declared, peoples would determine their own futures. Faisal came to Paris to claim Arabia's future. He was eloquent. He was dignified. He presented the Arab case with passion and reason. He reminded the assembled powers of the promises that had been made, of the blood that had been shed, of the expectations that had been raised. He was completely ignored. The great powers had no intention of honoring commitments to peoples they considered unready for self-government. The language of self-determination was for Europeans, Poles, Czechs, Yugoslavs. It was not for Arabs, Africans, or Asians. Wilson himself sent a commission, the King Crane Commission, to determine what the peoples of the former Ottoman territories actually wanted. The commissioners traveled through Syria and Palestine, interviewed local leaders, surveyed public opinion. Their findings were inconvenient. The people wanted independence, not European rule. They opposed Zionist immigration. If they had to have foreign involvement, they preferred America to Britain or France. The report was suppressed. Its recommendations were ignored. The great powers proceeded with partition as if they had never asked. What emerged from Paris was the League of Nations mandate system. Colonial rule with better vocabulary. The mandates were described as tutelage, preparation for eventual independence. The mandatory powers would provide administrative advice and assistance until the populations could stand alone. In practice, it meant European colonial rule under international sanction. France received mandates for Syria and Lebanon. Britain received mandates for Iraq and Transjordan and Palestine. The borders were Sykes-Picot with slight modifications. The populations were never consulted. And the populations did not accept their new masters quietly. In Syria, a General Syrian Congress met in March 1920 and declared independence. They proclaimed Faisal king of a united Syria, including Lebanon and Palestine. France responded with force. On July 24, 1920, French troops under General Henri Gourard defeated the Syrian army at the Battle of Mazalon. The Syrian commander, Yusuf al-Azma, was killed. The short-lived Syrian kingdom was destroyed. France marched into Damascus and established colonial rule. Faisal, the prince who had captured Damascus, who had pleaded the Arab cause at Paris, who had believed in British promises, was driven into exile. In Iraq, a massive revolt erupted in the summer of 1920. Iraqi tribes across the country rose against British rule. Sunni and Shia fought together, one of the few times in Iraqi history. They fought against the foreign occupier. They demanded that independence they had been promised. Britain crushed the revolt with overwhelming force. Winston Churchill, now Secretary of State for War and Air, authorized the use of air power and poison gas against the Iraqi rebels. I am strongly in favor of using poison gas against uncivilized tribes, Churchill wrote in a department memo. It is not necessary to use only the most deadly gases. Gases can be used which cause great inconvenience and would spread a lively terror. Approximately 10,000 Iraqis died in the revolt. Britain maintained control. The liberation from Ottoman rule had become subjugation to European rule. The peoples of the Middle East would not forget. Now Britain needed to govern these mandates. It needed local rulers who would provide legitimacy while remaining dependent on British power. Britain turned to the family it had betrayed, the Hashemites. Faisal, driven from Syria by the French, needed a throne. Britain gave him Iraq. In 1921, Churchill convened the Cairo Conference to organize the Middle Eastern mandates. T.E. Lawrence was there, serving as advisor, still trying to salvage something for his Arab friends. Churchill's solution was elegant from an imperial perspective. Install the Hashemite princes as kings, bind them to Britain with treaties, and rule through them. Faisal was made king of Iraq in 1921, August. He was a Hashemite from the Hejaz, an outsider with no local base, no connection to Iraq's history, no legitimacy except what British power provided. He would rule a country that had never existed. 3 Ottoman provinces cobbled together by Britain, containing Kurds who wanted independence, Sunni Arabs who expected to rule, and Shia Arabs who constituted the majority but were excluded from power. Abdullah, Hussein's second son, received Transjordan, a territory carved from the Palestine Mandate, a consolation prize for a prince without a kingdom. In March 1921, Abdullah had arrived in Transjordan with a small army, ostensibly planning to attack French Syria to avenge his brother Faisal's expulsion. Churchill met with him in Transjordan and persuaded him to accept rule over Transjordan instead. The Hashemite kingdom of Jordan, as it's now called, still exists. Abdullah's great-grandson sits on the throne. It is one of the few Sykes-Picot creations that has survived, largely because the Hashemites have maintained close relationships with first Britain, then America, receiving external support necessary to survive in a hostile region. And what if Hussein himself, the father of the revolt, the man who had trusted British promises? Hussein had enemies closer to home. In the interior of Arabia, the House of Saud had been building power for generations, allied with a puritanical Wahhabi religious movement. Abd al-Aziz ibn Saud was a warrior and statesman, and he wanted Arabia for himself. While Hussein was negotiating with the British and launching his revolt, Ibn Saud was conquering. He took Riyadh in 1902. He consolidated control over the Najd. He crushed his rivals, and he began looking at Hussein's Hejaz. Britain, ever pragmatic, watched the rivalry develop and ultimately backed the winner. In 1924 and 1925, Ibn Saud's forces conquered the Hejaz. His warriors captured Mecca and Medina, Islam's holiest cities. Hussein, the Sharif who had launched the Arab Revolt on British promises, was driven into exile. He died in Amman in 1931, a guest of his son Abdullah, in a kingdom the British had created, having lost everything he had fought for. His sons received Iraq and Jordan as consolation. Ibn Saud received Arabia. The kingdom of Saudi Arabia was proclaimed in 1932. In 1938, American geologists discovered oil beneath the desert. The modern Middle East, with its oil wealth, its Wahhabi extremism, its alliance between American power and Saudi autocracy, was born. Britain emerged from the Second World War, exhausted and bankrupt. The empire that had drawn the lines on the Middle Eastern maps could no longer defend them. The decisive moment came in 1956, when Egyptian President Nasser nationalized the Suez Canal. Britain and France, in collusion with Israel, invaded. They expected to reassert their power, to remind the world who controlled the crossroads between East and West. President Eisenhower was furious. He had not been consulted, and he demanded withdrawal. Britain and France complied. The humiliation was complete. The old colonial powers were finished in the Middle East. The United States was now the dominant Western force. The Eisenhower Doctrine, announced in 1957, formalized America's assumption of Britain's role. The United States would provide economic and military assistance to any Middle Eastern country requesting help against communist aggression. We had inherited the map. We had inherited the mandates. We had inherited the contradictions. And we inherited states that could only survive through authoritarianism. Iraq, 3 Ottoman provinces welded together containing hostile populations with no shared identity, required a strong man to hold them together. Every Iraqi government from the monarchy through Saddam Hussein understood this. When America invaded in 2003 and destroyed the regime, the artificial state fell apart exactly along the lines Britain had ignored. Syria, a French creation containing Alawites, Sunnis, Druze, Kurds, Christians likewise required authoritarian rule. The Saud family, Alawites ruling a Sunni majority, maintained power through secret police and military force. When the Arab Spring came in 2011, Syria collapsed into civil war along the sectarian lines France had established a century earlier. And we inherited the Israeli-Palestine conflict with no solution acceptable to all parties. The contradictions of the Balfour Declaration, a national home for Jews that would not prejudice Arab rights, were never resolved. They cannot be resolved. Every war, every intifada, every failed peace process flows from promises made and broken more than a century ago. We inherited the Saudi alliance, oil for security, stability for extremism. The Wahhabi ideology that Ibn Saud carried to power did not stay in Arabia. Saudi oil wealth, exploding after the price spike in the 1970s, funded the global spread of puritanical, intolerant version of Islam. Saudi money built mosques and madrasas from Pakistan to Indonesia to Europe. Saudi-funded institutions trained the preachers who spread the ideology behind Al-Qaeda, behind ISIS, behind the Taliban. 15 of the 19 September 11th hijackers were Saudi nationals. The ideology that attacked America on that day was nurtured with Saudi petrodollars. And yet, the alliance continues. Because oil. We inherited populations who remember the betrayals, the broken promises, the arbitrary borders, the military suppressions, the support for dictators. These are not ancient histories in the Middle East. They are living memory. They are passed from generation to generation. They are why Sykes-Picot remains a term of contempt. Why ISIS could mobilize fighters by promising to erase the colonial borders. Why American claims to support self-determination are met with bitter laughter. Why every American intervention operates within this framework. We cannot escape it because we refuse to acknowledge it. The founders of the American Republic warned against exactly this kind of entanglement. Washington counseled against permanent alliances. Jefferson warned against entangling ourselves with European affairs. Madison warned that war transforms republics into engines of executive power. We did not listen. We intervened in the European war that produced Sykes-Picot. We inherited the consequences when European empires collapsed. We've been trying to manage those consequences ever since. We cannot fix what we do not understand. And we cannot understand the Middle East without understanding how it was made, by whom, for what purpose, and at whose expense. We began today with two dreams of freedom, Arab and Turkish, both destined for betrayal. The Young Turks, who believed they could save the Ottoman Empire through reform, led it instead to destruction. Enver Pasha's gambles cost millions of lives. The empire he thought he was saving was dismembered by the powers he had challenged. The Arabs, who believed they were fighting for independence, found themselves traded like property. The promises made by McMahon were nullified by the agreements Sykes and Picot had already signed. The freedom Hussein thought he was winning was stolen before the first shot was fired. And the peoples caught between, Kurds and Armenians, Christians and Jews, tribes and communities that had lived for centuries under Ottoman administration, found themselves enclosed in artificial states, divided by arbitrary borders, subjected to new masters who understood them no better than the old. The Middle East is not incomprehensible. It is the predictable result of imperial design. States created to serve empires do not serve their peoples. Borders drawn without regard for populations produce conflict. Promises made and broken generate grievances that persist for generations. The question for America is whether we can acknowledge this history and whether acknowledgement can lead to wisdom. As we end today, consider these questions. The borders drawn by Sykes and Picot a century ago still define nations, still shape conflicts, still determine who lives under which government. Why do you think artificial borders have proven so durable? And what would it take to transcend them? The Balfour Declaration promised a Jewish national home while protecting Arab rights, a promise that satisfied neither party and created a conflict that endures to this day. Was there any way to honor both commitments, or was the contradiction built in from the beginning? T.E. Lawrence knew the promises to Arabs were lies, yet continued to lead men in a cause he knew was doomed. What responsibility do individuals bear when they serve systems they know to be unjust? And America inherited Britain's role in the Middle East without ever examining what role that entailed. The promises made, the betrayals committed, the grievances accumulated. How has this inheritance shaped American policy? And how might understanding it change our approach? Next Sunday, Article 7 will examine America First, the old right, and the principled opposition to intervention that flourished before World War II. We will meet the senators and journalists who warned against entanglement, who questioned the march to war, and who were silenced by Pearl Harbor, but whose warnings proved prophetic. On Tuesday, we will release a contemporary application episode examining Gaza, Israel, and the enduring consequences of the borders drawn without consent and promises made without intention to keep them. I am Jeff Kellick, and this has been episode 6 of Empire of Liberty, America's Foreign Entanglements from the Founders to the Forever Wars on the Consequential Actions podcast. If you have enjoyed this episode and want to follow the series, please subscribe to our Substack page at consequentialactions.com, where you'll find all written articles as well as our previous series on the General Welfare Clause and the New Leviathan. Subscribe to our YouTube channel at Consequential Actions Podcast for video versions of all podcast episodes, and follow me on X at jkellick for updates, discussion, and announcements. We continue to post articles and welcome your participation. Until then, have a great day.